All right. Well, thank you very much. Just right off the top, I'd like to thank Graham for his assistance with the technology. I'd like to thank Diane for her enormous patience in setting this all up. I'd like to thank my dad for spurring me on to this. That's Michael Preston, for those of you who haven't figured out the names. And I believe I owe a thanks to Jim Wilson, who started this out a long time ago, just at the very beginning of the pandemic. And I was very leery about getting involved, but I'm here now. Just to comment quickly about the limey thing, you might find this interesting that the man accredited for the creation of inadvertently creating the daiquiri was Francis Drake, because while he was drinking his lime juice, he didn't fancy the taste of rum, which was part of his daily allotment. So he mixed his lime juice with rum and sugar to make it more palatable and consume all of the product at the same time, which of course made it a daiquiri, although it wasn't named by him or after him. But I just found that interesting, something I've learned in my travels.
Nice little tidbit to add to it. Thank you.
So in the early process of setting this all up, I got a voice message from Diane, who referred to the man in question as Fridtjof Nansen. Now, she's not wrong. I'm sure he spent most of his life rather cold, but it's actually Fridtjof. So I'm going to just to start off, let's all learn how to pronounce it correctly. You don't have to unmute, but try and say it with me. Okay, we're going to say the man's name. It's Nansen.
Nansen.
I think everybody can do that. I'm just kidding. Fridtjof Nansen, one of my heroes, if not my biggest hero. You'll find that a lot of people that work in this industry, in my industry, in the polar exploration expedition game, also feel very much the same way. I think that I probably have the ladies' attention with this picture, possibly even a few of the gentlemen. Fridtjof Nansen was born in October of 1861. He was an excellent student and an avid sportsman. And based on his early life, it was easy to assume that people saw a great deal in him. They saw talent. He chose a career early on in zoology because he felt that it would take him, in his words, outdoors. Early in 1882, Nansen took, and I'm quoting here, "the first fatal step that led me astray from the quiet life of science." One of his teachers, Professor Robert Collette of the university's zoology department, proposed that Nansen take a sea voyage, which he did on a sealing vessel called the Viking. It was also to work on his thesis and to study the Arctic zoology firsthand. So the picture on the left is Nansen as a student, as a young man. You can see on the bottom it says Christiania, which is now, of course, Oslo. On the right is a map depicting Greenland. You can see Baffin on the far left. Norway is highlighted in red. Svalbard is the island archipelago, for those of you not familiar with it. And the northernmost point of Svalbard is one of the very closest to the North Pole. So it's a frequent spot for polar exploration. So while he was at sea on the Viking, he became an excellent marksman. And of course, it was the nature of the job. He shot over 200 seals in a single day. And he conducted various forms of research, including studying psychrophiles, which are the planktons that grow under the ice, feed the krill feeds the fish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that is the food chain. He also proved conclusively for the first time that sea ice formed from the surface down, which was the exact opposite of the conventions of the day. And he discovered that it was the warmer waters of the Gulf Stream. He discovered that the warm waters of the Gulf Stream passed underneath the very cold Arctic Sea. The ship became icebound off the northeast coast of Greenland, between Greenland and Svalbard. in an area that had been previously unexplored. And as he sat there stuck on the ship, he formulated his early plans to cross Greenland, which hadn't been done at that point. He returned to Norway and took a curator's position at the Museum of Bergen. Nansen's chosen area of study was neuroanatomy, specifically the central nervous system of lower marine creatures. And his paper, the structure and combination of histological elements of the central nervous system, sounds like a real page turner, doesn't it? Would be published in 1887, and this was his doctoral thesis. He became quite obsessed with the idea of crossing Greenland, and in 1887, he submitted his thesis, and with that out of the way, he started to organize his plans. Up until that point, only 2 expeditions had attempted the crossing. One of them was led by Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld, who was a Swede, and Robert Peary, who's a name you're probably familiar with from the US. Both men started in Disco Bay and traveled east. Both were very, very complicated and logistically heavy operations, and neither one made it. The furthest to make it only made it about 160 kilometers. So he immediately abandoned the idea of moving from east to west and decided on the exact opposite approach. His plan was as elegant as it was simple. As part of the plan, he borrowed a page from the Conquistador Pizarro, which was to burn his boats behind him. He was going to start on the east and head to the west, towards the populated area. This would avoid the necessity of a return journey, and it would also avoid having to place caches of food and supplies. Also, by destroying his boats, both he and his men would have no choice but to continue on. Somebody is unmuted. In addition, the men carried the equipment that they would need on man-hauled sledges, and they would ski the distance. Nansen wanted a crew. He wanted to recruit from the Telemark region of Norway, but he couldn't find any volunteers. And somebody suggested that he use indigenous Sami guides for their skiing abilities and their winter skills. So he accepted 2 of them to his team. You can see those terrific hats on that are bookending the photo there. These are 2 of his indigenous Sami guides. And among the other 3 men was Otto Sverdrup, a former sea captain named Olaf Christian Dietrichson, an army officer, and Christian Christensen. I want to repeat the name Sverdrup as it comes up quite a bit in polar exploration, both north and south. The Norwegian government, however, thought his plan was foolhardy and refused to donate any money towards what they felt would result in certain death for him and his men. So he eventually managed to wrangle the money from a liquor baron named Augustin Gamel. Some of you may have tried Gameldansk, which is a Scandinavian spirit. I don't care for it personally, but that's neither here nor there. He also received some money from private donations. Immediately before his departure, he defended his thesis before the devil's advocates. On June 3rd, 1888, the Jason, the name of his ship, departed Isafjordur in Iceland towards Greenland. Progress was initially hindered by heavy pack ice just within sight of Greenland, but he was very excited to get going. So on July 17th, 12 nautical miles off the coast, Nansen ordered the boats lowered within sight of Sirmilik. The ice, however, proved far too dense for them to get through. In fact, for much of the time, they weren't even able to keep the boats in the water and were forced to camp on ice floes. Caught in the pack and you'll see the line drawn on the right of your screen in blue. They drifted south, as far south as 62 degrees north, and ended up having to row 120 miles north back through the brash and pack ice before finally landing at Umedijk. Over the next few days, the party struggled to ascend, to go up towards the inland ice cap. Very treacherous, lots of crevasses. And the weather was in general very, very bad for pretty much the entire expedition. On one occasion, all progress stopped completely because of violent storms and continuous rain. On the 26th of August, Nansen finally came to the conclusion that there was no chance of reaching Kassigian-Gut, which was known as Christianshavn, and might be easier to stick with Christianshavn. The Inuit name is quite complicated, which is a town located in Western Greenland on the southeastern shore of Disco Bay in the Kerkatalik municipality. And they had to reach there by mid-September, which is when the last ship was due to leave. I just added this because it's a bit of an easier map to understand. If you've been to Greenland, you will have traveled from Kangerlussuaq and gone most of the coast. Most of the cruises go up the coast towards Ilulissat, circle around Disco Island, which is the island in the top left of that right-hand map. Some continue on to my favorite place, which is Umiak, before coming back down to Kangerlussuaq. At any rate, he decided on a change of course. Rather than going north and west towards Christianshavn, he was going to go almost directly due west towards Godthab, which we now know as Nuuk. The men in his party reputedly hailed the change of plan with acclamation. I imagine they were quite pleased. They continued climbing until the 11th of September, when they finally reached a height of 2,700 meters above sea level on the summit of the ice cap, and the temperatures were dropping as low as minus 46 degrees centigrade at night. But from then on, it was now a downward slope. They'd crossed the dome and were making their way towards the coast. The terrain was still difficult. The weather was not very kind to them. And they finally arrived in Nuuk in October of 1888, and were greeted by the town's Danish official, who was quite pleased to inform Fridtjof Nansen that his thesis had been accepted and he had been awarded a doctorate. They'd been on this expedition now for 78 days, with only 49 of those on land. 29 days they spent on the ice and at sea in a very small boat. They were too late on arrival to return to Norway. All the ships had sailed, so they spent the next 7 months hunting, fishing, and studying the local culture. So Nansen had made the front pages. The Fidbjornen, the ship called the White Bear in English, finally reached Copenhagen on the 21st of May in 1889. And news of his successful crossing preceded his arrival, and Nansen and his teammates were celebrated as heroes. The welcome in Copenhagen in Denmark, however, was dwarfed in comparison to their reception in Christiania and Oslo just a week later, and somewhere between 30 to 40,000 people, almost a third of the city's entire population, jammed the streets as the party made its way to a series of receptions. The interest and enthusiasm generated by the expedition's achievement led to the formation of the Norwegian Geographical Society. Nansen was offered and accepted a position as curator of the Royal Frederick University's zoology collection, which was a post that carried a significant salary but didn't have any real hard duties. They were just happy to have his name on their board. Nansen's main task in the weeks that followed his return was, of course, the writing of his account of the expedition. But he found time in June of that year to visit London, where he met with the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, and he addressed a meeting of the Royal Geographical Society. The president of the RGS, and this is a wonderful name here, Sir Mountstuart Elphinstone Grant Duff, said that, quote, Nansen has claimed, quote, the foremost place amongst northern explorers. He was later awarded the Society's very prestigious Founders Medal. This was just one of the many honors that Nansen was showered with all across Europe. He was invited by Australia to make an attempt on the South Pole, but Nansen felt that that Norway's best interests were a Norwegian attempt on the North Pole. Makes sense. It's, after all, in their and our backyards. So he was now planning his attempt on the North Pole, and he was going to use currents and drift ice. Some of you may be familiar with this. And this was demonstrated by the discovery of timbers of a ship called the USS Jeannette. Looking at this map, the Jeannette was an expedition vessel that was ice-bound in the New Siberian Islands and crushed. And timbers from the vessel were found off the coast of Greenland. So there was a man named Henrik Mohn who surmised from this that there was a powerful ocean current that traveled from east to west. And Nansen figured that this very probably went straight across the top of the world, possibly over the pole itself. So therefore, a strong enough ship might enter the ice pack where the Jeannette met its demise, and hopefully just let the ice do the work and drift. So what he needed for this was a very small, very sturdy ship with a very specially designed hull. He designed the ship himself, or at least participated in it. And he needed a ship that would hold fuel and provisions for 12 men for up to 5 years at sea. They were going to enter the pack where the Jeannette sank, as I mentioned, and hopefully drift over the pole and emerge in the sea above Spitsbergen. Adolphus Greely, who was one of the men whose own expeditions ended in tragedy, it was an absolute fiasco, was very skeptical of the plan, called it an illogical scheme of self-destruction. And Englishmen, Sir Alan Young of Franklin Search fame and Sir Joseph Hooker, who had sailed with James Clark Ross, who's a very, very famous polar explorer in both spheres, both North and South, they were very dismissive of his plans. However, what wasn't funded by the Norwegian government and private donations was made up with a national appeal, which is really rather impressive when you consider that Norway has only come into its wealth in the last generation from their oil and gas revenues. The ship itself, the Fram, which translates into English as the Forward, she was 39 meters by 11 meters. She had a rounded bathtub-shaped hull made out of very, very strong oak with multiple cross beams and braces. Speed and sailing efficiency were secondary to her design. It was intended that as the ice formed around them, rather than crushing the hull and pinning them, they would be lifted out of the ice and simply sail above it. She was to be captained by Otto Sverdrup. There's that name again. Now, if you look at this picture, the lower left is a picture of the Fram as she now is. She's in the Fram Museum in Oslo. I haven't been in years. My dad took me there when I was a boy, and I remember it. I also remember that it's very close to the Viking Museum. It's a terrific museum by all accounts. But on the right is another ship, another Norwegian expedition ship, and that's, some of you may recognize it, that's the Maud. And this is one of Amundsen's ships, and it sank in the Canadian Arctic and remained there for more than half a century until the Norwegian government asked the local Inuit if they could come and bring it up, because they wanted to take it back to the Fram. And of course, the Inuit said, yeah, sure, don't expect us to participate and don't expect any money from us, but you're more than welcome to it. So they, at their own expense, came and they lifted the Maud off the sea bottom and towed her home for renovation for display at the Fram Museum. But the reason I enclose this is if you look very carefully, you can see the thickness of the hull of these ships. That's over a meter thick, that hull. And that was designed specifically to withstand the enormous pressure of the ice. She's not there anymore. As I say, she was taken back to the Fram Museum. I, as a matter of fact, quite by accident, ended up sailing past her through the Bellot Straits on the Northwest Passage trip. None of us were expecting it. It was really quite a remarkable moment. So at any rate, back to Nansen. They left Norway via the Northeast Passage, which had been pioneered by Adolf Erik Nordenskjold. The Nordenskjold family is relevant both in the north and in the south. And if I come back, perhaps I'll tell a wonderful Antarctic story about Nordenskjold. But the idea was to sail very tightly. You can follow the red line along the Russian northern seaboard from west to east, and then travel north to enter the pack near the New Siberian Islands, which is where the Jeanette sank, as I mentioned. 10 days later, after they approached the area, they finally saw the heavy pack ice at around a latitude of 78 degrees north. Nansen followed the line of the pack further north to a position recorded as 78 degrees, 49 minutes north, 132 degrees, 53 minutes east, before he ordered the engine stopped and the rudder raised. And this is where the Fram's drift began. Now, this map, it may not look like that much of a voyage, but just to give you an idea, the distance marked out in blue is approximately the same distance as Toronto to Saskatoon. It's a huge amount of ocean. Russia, don't forget, has 53% of the Arctic Circle within its borders. So the Fram was frozen in. The first few weeks stuck in the ice was very frustrating as the drift removed. They were at the mercy of the drift. Sometimes it moved to the north, which was working in their favor. Sometimes it moved to the south, and sometimes continuously to the south, which was particularly frustrating. But after the turn of the new year in January of 1894, the northerly direction became more settled, and the 80-degree mark was finally passed on the 22nd of March. Remember, the ship's not sailing, it's just wedged firmly in the ice. Nansen calculated that at this particular rate of passage, it would take the ship 5 years to reach the pole. As the ship's northerly progress continued at a rate rarely above a mile a day, a nautical mile a day, or 1.6 kilometers, Nansen started formulating a new plan, and this was to leave the ship and do a dog sledge journey. So Nansen decided finally to leave the ship when they achieved 83 degrees north, and they were going to start a dog sled journey. They spent the winter of 94-95 preparing sleds, kayaks, and clothing for the journey. In January of 95, the Fram finally attained 83 degrees, 34 minutes north, which was some 10 minutes north, 10 nautical miles higher than Adolphus Greely's previous record. He left the ship with a man named Hjalmar Johansson. Nansen hoped to achieve about 7 nautical miles a day on foot with the dogs. But their section readings, early section readings, showed that after a week, they were traveling at a rate of about 9 nautical miles a day, which is very positive, 17 kilometers a day, putting them quite far ahead of schedule. However, the surface was very uneven. So sometimes their speeds were significantly slowed, and the pack was constantly moving towards the south. So sort of like moving on a treadmill. Now, to explain the uneven surface, imagine the ice that you see on Lake Ontario, for instance, in the winter. Imagine these huge, huge sheets of ice slowly being forced together by wind and by currents. And of course, when they hit, they buckle. It's sort of like plate tectonics writ small. And what happens with these things is frequently they freeze together and form multi-year ice, which just continues to build and build and build. It's very, very durable. It lasts from year to year to year, and it creates massive hummocks. So you think about polar ice, and you think it's going to be a long flat surface, but cross-country skiing, it's not. There are a lot of things in the way. A lot of these ice hummocks that had to be overcome. Some of them quite big. At any rate, he confided in his diary, I have become more and more convinced that we ought to turn before time. And on the 7th of April, after making camp and observing that the way ahead was, another quote, a veritable chaos of ice blocks stretching as far as the horizon, excuse me, Nansen finally decided to turn south. They recorded their final latitude furthest north as 86 degrees 13.6 minutes north, almost 3 full degrees, 180 nautical miles beyond the previous farthest north mark. And at that point, they decided to turn back towards Franz Josef Land. Personally, I wonder if Hjalmar Johansen claimed the change of plan, or hailed the change of plan with acclamation, as the men had done previous to that. So on the return, beg your pardon, I'm confusing myself. This is the first time that I've had to work on notes with this, as opposed to reading the notes from the screen while sharing the screen in a public room. On the return journey, they lost the use of their chronometers, and without knowing the correct time, of course, they had a very difficult time figuring out exactly where they were. So they restarted their watches based on Nansen's guess that they were still at a longitude of 86 degrees. But from then on in, they were uncertain of their actual true bearing, which made navigation very difficult, and they just had to keep recalibrating using their last known positions. So uncertain of their position, they felt the best option was to continue in a direction west-southwest, and eventually started seeing fox and bear tracks, which in and of itself is not indicative of land, because the foxes follow the bears and the bears travel wherever they like, off in search of food. But soon they also started to see seals, which meant that the spring was coming. And they also, most importantly, started to see gulls, because of course gulls do nest on land. And unlike other birds, gulls do not fly quite as far as, say, an albatross. Albatross will travel hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers at sea looking for food to bring back to their young, whereas gulls will stay much closer to home. So it meant that land was nearby. So by May the 31st, by Nansen's calculation, they were about 50 nautical miles, 93 kilometers, from a place called Cape Fligely, which was the northernmost known point of Franz Josef Land. However, the conditions were worsening and the warmer weather was causing the ice to break. On the 22nd of June, the pair decided to rest on a large, stable ice floe while they repaired their equipment and gathered their strength to continue the journey. And they remained on this floe for about a month. The day after leaving camp, Nansen recorded, or the day that they left the camp, Nansen recorded that at last the marvel has come to pass, land, and after we had almost given up our belief in it. Now, whether this still distant visible land was Franz Josef Land, or a new discovery. They didn't know because it wasn't a terribly well explored area, and they only had a very rough sketched map to go on. On the 6th of August, they reached the edge of the ice where they shot the last of their dogs. They had been killing the weakest regularly to feed the others. They lashed the 2 kayaks, raised a sail, and made sail towards land. It was soon clear that this land was part of a group of islands. As they moved slowly southward, Nansen tentatively identified a headland as Cape Felder, which was on the western edge of Franz Josef Land. Towards the end of August, as the weather started to get colder and travel became more difficult by boat, they decided that they were going to have to camp for the winter in a sheltered cove. So with stones and mosses as building materials, they built a hut, which would be their home for the next 8 months. Ready supplies of bear meat and seal meat and walrus meat, which kept their larder stocked, and the fat of these animals kept them also in heat and flame. So their principal problem was not hunger, rather inactivity. Must have been terribly boring. But the weather eventually started to turn. And they decided to start preparing to leave their refuge, gathering meat and supplies to take with them. But it was the 19th of May before they were finally able to resume their journey in 1896. I should add that one of the ways that the men stayed on such a level keel was they continually addressed themselves only by their surnames, Mr. Nansen, Mr. Johansen, which is an interesting approach, I suppose, but everything was very civilized, everything was very calm and comfortable. But on the 17th of June, they were forced to stop for repairs after their kayaks were attacked by a walrus. And while walking around on shore, Nansen thought he heard the sounds of a dog barking and of voices. And of course he did. The dog was barking, the dog was running, and the voice was calling it back, as those of us who have had dogs know what that's like. He went to investigate, and he very shortly thereafter saw the figure of a man approaching. The guy on the left is a man named Frederick Jackson. He was an Englishman, and ironically, he had applied for the position of physician, ship's doctor on the expedition, but Nansen had to turn him down because Nansen was adamant that his crew be entirely Norwegian, very nationalistic. So Jackson decided to start his own expedition, which he did, which was an exploration of Franz Josef Land. By my understanding, quite a successful one, although I'm not terribly familiar with it. So he had succeeded. He'd found his way. On the 7th of August, Nansen and Johansen boarded Jackson's supply ship, the Windward, and sailed for Vardo, where they arrived on the 13th of August. They happened to be greeted by Hans Mohn, who was the meteorologist that originated the polar drift theory, who happened to be there by chance. And the rest of the world was informed by telegram of Nansen's safe return, but they still had no news of the Fram. They took the weekly mail steamer south from Vardo, and Nansen and Johansen reached Hammerfest on the 18th of August, and they learned that the Fram had finally emerged from the ice pack northwest of Spitsbergen, just as Nansen had predicted, and was now on her way home to Tromsø. And she hadn't passed over the pole. She hadn't exceeded Nansen's personal farthest north, but she had emerged exactly where she was, proving Nansen's theory right and proving Henrik Mohn's theory of continental drift right as well. So Nansen and Johansen sailed to Tromsø so that they could meet with their colleagues, and they were reunited. And the homeward voyage to Christiania to Oslo was a series of triumphant receptions at every port. They wouldn't have had to, but I imagine they did stop at every port, both to take advantage of the festivities and to celebrate with their countrymen. Finally, they were escorted into Oslo's harbor and greeted by the largest crowds, the largest group of people outside that Norway had ever seen. Nansen and his men were received by King Oscar, and he was reunited with his family. They were invited to stay as guests at Oscar's palace for several days. Excuse me. Tributes started pouring in. A very well-known British mountaineer named Edward Whymper wrote that Nansen had made, and I quote, almost as great an advance as has been accomplished by all other voyages in the 19th century put together. Nansen and his men were celebrated across Norway, Europe, and beyond. Greeley, the American, made a few bitchy comments in the American press. Apparently, it seems that some Americans just hate coming in second place, as we've seen recently. Pardon my pun. But Nansen, after this, retired from polar exploration and started to work on publishing his account of the voyage. The initial account sailed off the shelves, again, if you'll pardon the pun, but the money set him up financially for life. It was an enormously popular book, both in Norway and beyond, translated into many, many languages. The next 20 years of his life would be spent codifying the data amassed on the voyage into 6 scientific volumes. I'm going to pause here and say that the oceanographic data that the Fram had amassed, both with Nansen and without him, was truly remarkable, because it was the first time in history that they had had such a stable platform to make a lot of these studies. And I don't profess to be an expert on any of it, but when you stop and think that most of the measurements and readings and recordings that were made up until that point, regardless of which scientific endeavor you're in, was made from a moving ship. These were wooden ships. Often they were moving quite a bit. So even on a calm day, there was motion, whereas when you're stuck in the ice, you have a completely still platform. So it's really, really changed the entire science of oceanographic research. Nobile finally, an Italian named Nobile, finally surpassed his own furthest north in April of 1900. And unlike Greeley, Nansen took the news somewhat humbly, sent him a congratulatory telegram, and moved on. Over the years, Nansen proved a mentor to men like Nobile, but also to men like Roald Amundsen, Robert Falcon Scott, and Ernest Shackleton. And these are just a few of some of the most famous expeditions that took place in the South. And this is just in the South. You have to remember that my primary focus has always been on the Antarctic. But he also influenced men like the great Knut Rasmussen, who was a part Danish, part Greenlandic Inuit ethnologist and anthropologist, who did a lot of work both in Greenland and in the Canadian Arctic. But at any rate, he, as I say, Nansen was the first of them all, and he made such revolutionary changes in the whole procedure that he was highly sought out by everybody. So after all of this success, Nansen was a favorite son. Norwegians just loved him. He became a fierce advocate of Norwegian statehood, and he finally helped in promoting the secession of Norway from the Kingdom of Sweden, and they declared independence in 1905, May 17th, for those of you that don't know. And in that year, he was sent to the court of St. James as ambassador to negotiate new treaties recognizing Norway's new independent status. Unfortunately, he found diplomatic and state affairs and galas, etc., in his words, frivolous and boring. So he resigned this post, and sadly, shortly afterwards, he lost his wife to pneumonia, and he reapplied himself to science. He suffered some more personal tragedies in the form of his good friend Hjalmar Johansen, who had been sent home by Amundsen in shame He committed suicide, sadly. And also the sudden death of his youngest son, which must have been tragic, as we can all imagine. During World War I, most of Scandinavia was neutral, but the war was very, very hard on the young nation of Norway, particularly in the areas of trade. So Nansen managed to negotiate a treatment with Washington that helped alleviate famine in Norway. And in 1920, Norway joined the League of Nations. In April of 1920, Nansen helped organize, and this is the second part of his career. Most people that are familiar with Nansen are familiar with one aspect of his life or the other. They're familiar with the fact that he was an incredible explorer, or they're familiar with the fact that he was an incredible statesman. But the two go hand in hand, and I was completely unaware of the second part of his life. But at any rate, back to it. In 1920, Nansen helped organize the repatriation of 500,000 prisoners of war. And in 1921, he helped further repatriate 2 million displaced Russians. And he did this by designing what was called the temporary Nansen passport for stateless persons. And this was almost immediately recognized by over 30 nations. This was extended also to refugees from the Greco-Turkish War, 1919 to 1922. In 1922, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his, quote, his work for the repatriation of the prisoners of war, his work with the Russian refugees, his work to bring succor to the millions of Russians afflicted by famine, and finally, his present work for the refugees in Asia Minor and Thrace. Immediately after receiving the award and the prize, he donated all of the money back towards the international relief efforts. In 1925, he tried further to assist the refugees from the Armenian genocide. This was a very complicated plan, very logistically heavy, and involved the Soviet Union, which of course immediately sounds a bit of a death knell, as you might remember. Unfortunately, there wasn't a great deal of success, although the Armenians very much appreciated him, and he's widely admired and celebrated in that country still. In 1926, on behalf of Norway, he signed the Slavery Convention, which outlawed forced labor. And later in life, he was struck by the travel bug again, and he tried to organize his own expedition to fly to the North Pole by airship, but he couldn't amass the funding. His student, his favorite student, Roald Amundsen, disappeared during a rescue operation trying to find the missing members of one of Nobele's expeditions. Nobele was trying to achieve the North Pole by hot air balloon and crashed and sort of fell off the collective radar, quote unquote. Radar, of course, didn't actually exist at that point, but I'm just using it as an expression. So Amundsen's plane was found, but Amundsen was not. And Nansen delivered a nationwide eulogy, and he said of Amundsen, quote, "He found an unknown grave under the clear sky of the icy world, with the whirring of the wings of eternity through space." He was quite a gifted writer. Fridtjof Nansen died of a heart attack in 1930. But let's not end this on a sour note. Such a great man and a once in a generation thinker. I think he should be remembered more positively. So let's look briefly at his legacy. After his sudden death, the League of Nations established the Nansen International Office for Refugees, which won another Nobel Prize in 1938. So a second Nobel Prize that's associated with his name. As a young man, he embraced the revolution in skiing methods that transformed it from simply a means of winter travel to a universally appreciated sport. He was able to apply this expertise to the problems of polar travel. in both his Greenland and his Fram expeditions. He invented the Nansen sledge, the man-hauling sledge, with broad ski-like runners, the Nansen cooker, which improved vastly the heat efficiency of the spirit stoves that were then in use. And he was also the one who came up with the layering principle in polar clothing, whereby instead of wearing traditionally heavy, awkward garments, they were replaced with several layers of more lightweight material. This is still practiced. Some of you may have done a polar expedition to the Arctic or to the Antarctic. And this is one of the first things that we teach our guests is when you're going ashore, when you're going out in the Zodiac, layer your clothes. That way, if you're too warm, you can take something off and put it in your pack. If you're too cold, you can take something out of your pack and put it on. A lot of these things, the Nansen tent, the Nansen runners, the Nansen stoves, these are all still in use today, a long, long time after his initial uses of them. Scientifically, Nansen is recognized both as one of the founders of modern neurology and as a significant contributor, as I mentioned earlier, to oceanographical science. Numerous geographical features are named after him: the Nansen Basin and the Nansen Gackle Ridge in the Arctic Ocean, at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Mount Nansen in the Yukon region of Canada, and Mount Nansen, Mount Fridtjof Nansen, and Nansen Island, which are all located in Antarctica. In 2004, the Royal Norwegian Navy launched the first of a series of 5 Fridtjof Nansen class frigates. And the lead ship of the group is, of course, His Norwegian Majesty's ship, Fridtjof Nansen. The next 2 were named consecutively after Roald Amundsen and the aforementioned Otto Sverdrup. And I'm going to start my closing by saying that in 1926, Nansen was elected as the rector of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, becoming the very first foreigner to hold this largely honorary position. And at his inaugural address, he said, and this is probably my favorite quote of all time, "We all have a land of beyond to seek in our life. What more can we ask? Our part is to find the trail that leads to it. A long trail, a hard trail, maybe, but the call comes to us and we have to go. Rooted deep in the nature of every one of us is the spirit of adventure, the call of the wild, vibrating under all our actions, making life deeper and higher and nobler." And finally, to finish off, in 1964, the International Astronautical Union adopted the name Nansen for an impact crater. Nansen's name is now at the lunar North Pole. And that was my 6 degrees of Fridtjof Nansen.